In the early 1800s, the United States had about three different economic regions. We had the North, which was primarily dominated by factories, and these factories now employed a lot of different workers, and these laborers all depended on manufacturing and trading their goods. So, for the North, who supported these tariffs, these taxes on foreign goods, so that they could sell their goods at a lower price to ensure that the people would buy American goods and not British goods or any other European goods. We also had the southern region, and the South was primarily dominated now by large plantations, which were worked primarily by slaves. So, it was an economy still based on agriculture, based on those cash crops, particularly cotton and tobacco, were the two main cash crops in the South. Now, the South sold these raw materials usually to their European partners, and so the South would depend on buying imported goods. So they opposed the tariffs because that would mean that the goods that they bought would be more expensive than in the North. And they really felt that these tariffs were favoring the North over them. They also feared that their European partners would get angry that their goods were being taxed so much that they in turn would start to tax their own imports and would hurt the Southern economy. The third region, which was now emerging, was the West. More people were moving out west into this new frontier, and this was now an emerging economy. More people were settling there. And in the West, their primary concern was the fact that they wanted to be able to get cheap land from the government and really focus on internal improvements, on the creation of roads and transportation like canals, to be able to trade and transport and be able to start to build their economy over in the West. So these were the three primary regions during the 1800s that emerged. Now, when John Quincy Adams, right, this was the son of John Adams, before he left the presidency, he passed what was known or became known as the Tariff of Abomination, right? And this tariff placed a very high tax on imports. And the purpose was to be able to promote American manufacturing, to promote the sale and the production of American goods. Now, for the South, this greatly harmed their economy. Particularly, South Carolina became a huge proponent, a spokesperson to say, against this tariff. Now, they thought that once Andrew Jackson became president in 1828, that he would reduce this tariff, since Andrew Jackson was a supporter of the South. He was a supporter of the slave states. They thought that he would do something about the tariff, but he didn't when he came into office. So John C. Calhoun, right, old scary eyes over here, remember, he was Andrew Jackson's vice president. He was also from South Carolina. Now, he felt very strongly against this tariff, and when he realized that Jackson was not going to do anything about this tariff, he actually resigned from being vice president, and that's how Martin Van Buren became the new vice president of Jackson. John C. Calhoun is credited with writing something known as the states' rights doctrine. And under this doctrine, right, it believed that the states created the national government, right? The national government was made up by the states. So therefore, the state power should actually be greater than the federal power because they're the ones who actually form the national government. That's the theory behind the states' rights doctrine. And this is going to be a very important doctrine because it's really going to divide the nation between those states who believe this idea of the states' rights doctrine and those representative in states that believe in the idea that the federal government is stronger, that the unity of the nation outpowers the individual state. And that conflict is going to continue for a very long time because it's still going to lead into eventually the Civil War, which was really the core of what the argument was there. So within Congress, right, there was this debate over those who believed in states' rights and those who believed in federal authority. So those like John C. Calhoun and other southern states really thought that that tariff was an abomination, right? Which meant it was something hateful. And because they believed in the states' rights doctrine, if they had more power than the federal government because they created the federal government, then the states have the ability to nullify, right? To ignore a federal law with which they disagree with, right? And John C. Calhoun became a huge supporter of this idea that the southern states, South Carolina and all of the other southern states, had the right to nullify that tariff and not follow it if they didn't agree with it. And that's known as the Ordinance of Nullification. Now, on the other hand, you had those who believed in federal authority. One representative, known as Daniel Webster, promoted national unity over state rights, that was more important, that we're one nation now, and the federal government is the government of the whole country, and that has more power than one individual state. President Jackson, though he was a supporter of state rights, didn't agree with what the other states was doing. He realized as president that keeping the nation together was more important. So he opposed what the southern states were doing. He opposed that nullification. So Jackson ended up having to sign a new bill known as the Force Bill, where he was actually going to send the army into South Carolina and into the southern states to make them start to uphold the law of the tariff. Now, because South Carolina then saw that military force was coming over to them, a lot of the other southern states then decided not to join with South Carolina because they were afraid that this was going to lead to some kind of armed conflict. And Henry Clay, then, the representative from Kentucky, right, he came up with a compromise that would lower the tariff over several years. And so Congress decided that they would go ahead with that. They would agree to lower the tariff. And then South Carolina decided that they wouldn't break away from the Union. They would agree to enforce the law. And so any kind of military conflict was avoided at this time. So this was known as the Compromise Tariff of 1833. South Carolina agreed to uphold the tariff, and Congress promised that over years, this tariff, this tax, would go down. Now, this also meant that the nullification ordinance and the force bill, that was now put out of practice. That was no longer necessary. So this compromise kind of calmed things down for a while, but the idea over states' rights and the national government, those beliefs would not really be addressed, and they wouldn't be come to a solution yet. That's why this issue eventually would continue over time and would lead us to the Civil War.